the Dutch set up a governor named Peter Stuyvesant. I'm not going to write that name down, but essentially Peter Stuyvesant would not allow any kind of democracy, and he said, I'm boss around here and my orders are to be obeyed. And he had lost his leg in one of his wars. He was a soldier, and he would stamp on his peg leg and, you know, tell the people who descended with him to go home. So the Duke of York, the brother of King James, the brother of King Charles II, who later became King James. Charles II had no legitimate children. So anyway, the Duke of York sent a navy, and they took New Amsterdam from the Dutch and set up a colony that's which they called New York, named after York, the Duke of York. King James, I mean, he became King James II, but he originally was the Duke of York. If you know anything about English royalty, they'll name their heir apparent Prince of Wales, or Princess of Wales, and they named their oldest brother after them, Duke of York. Anyway, New York, and that was the founder of the New York colony. Now back to the Quakers. William Penn. Oh yes, just a minute. Okay, I'm sorry, I overlooked something. I overlooked something badly, so we're going to have to back up. John Calvin was a Protestant theologian at the early time of the Reformation, and he was the man that the Puritans followed. The Puritans believed in predestination. Basically, they believed that you could not do anything at all to be saved, that whether or not you were saved was determined before you were born, from the foundation of the world. Actually, before the earth existed, God knew who would be saved and who wouldn't, and you had nothing to do with it. Predestination. And this belief was held by the Presbyterians and the Puritans and the French Huguenots. A lot of European Protestants followed the teachings of John Calvin. I must mention that. Now, predestination was undermined later by the revival movements, which we'll talk about, that happened later. That you had a choice in your salvation. You could decide whether you'd be saved or not, and you can even change society if you wanted to. You could end the evils of society. That you could take responsibility. All right, now back to Pennsylvania. My apologies for jumping around a bit. King Charles II owed William Penn a lot of money because William Penn had inherited money from his father, and the king, Charles II was the one whose father's head had been chopped off, and Charles knew he had to govern through Parliament. Well, Charles II accumulated a large amount of debt, and he did not dare tax the people without Parliament. Very important, folk, you know this. In England, it had been firmly established that all tax laws had to be done by Parliament, and the king could not arbitrarily raise taxes. Now, Charles I had tried to do this. Charles I had his head chopped off. So Charles II wanted to spend more money than he had. He borrowed money from other people, including William Penn, and after a while it became obvious to William Penn that the king could not pay the debt. Anyway, William Penn and the king were close friends. Admiral Penn, the father, both of them, there were two William Penns, the father and son. The father was an admiral. The son was going to follow his father's footsteps, but the son, William, converted to Quakerism. And of course, the Quakers do not believe in wars and becoming admirals, becoming generals in the army, do not believe in joining the army. When the father, Admiral Penn, heard that his son became a Quaker, he was going to disown him and disinherit him. Kicked him out of the house, but then he had second thoughts. So he went out in the streets of London, found his son, and brought him back in, inheritance and all. So when the old admiral died, young William inherited the debt that was owed to him by the king, and it was obvious that the king could not pay. There's a story one time that the king and the admiral were sitting around in a room talking to each other, and the king took off his crown. William Penn still had to see. William Penn, being a Quaker, he would not take his hat off for anyone, not even a king. Now, William was supposed to, by common law, was supposed to have taken his hat off when he was in the presence of the king. He didn't. So the king took his crown off and laid the crown down. Now again, William Penn was supposed to address him as Your Majesty. He didn't. So William said to the king, "Friend, why dost thou remove thy crown?" But many of these Quakers spoke in old-fashioned language. The king said, "Well, it's customary that when you're in the presence of a king, only one person should have his head covered. And since you insist on keeping your head covered, I thought my head would be uncovered, so that only one of us would have their head covered while in the presence of a king." The king and William, they went on with their conversation after that. The king was his head uncovered. William Penn with his head covered. Anyway, when it became obvious that the king could not pay the debt, the king said to William, "You take a plot of land just west of the Delaware River, and I'll give you that land in payment of the debt." This land is today known as Pennsylvania. It was not named after young William, Quaker William. It was actually named after the Admiral, William's father. This is a little bit of a technicality, but anyway, the king, to keep Penn's name alive, who was his close friend, wanted the land named Penn's Woods or Pennsylvania. William Penn decided he would found a colony where that everybody was welcome, and to his credit, he founded the colony of Pennsylvania. He insisted that no land should be taken from the Indians without paying for it, so he bought the land from the Indians. And for many, many years after that, Pennsylvania had no Indian massacres. There was peace between Pennsylvania, the Indians, and the colony of Pennsylvania. Now, I must state, folk, this peace did not last. Eventually, the Pennsylvanians rose up and drove all the Indians out, owing to the fact that there was a clash, and the Indians, they're sometimes called the Lenape or sometimes called the Delaware. They wound up taking white children and keeping them captive for many years. They said, "You killed our children, therefore we have a right to take your children." The white colonists didn't think so, so they got together an army, took their children back by force, and drove the Indians out of Pennsylvania. If you go to Pennsylvania today, you won't find any Indians who are officially Indian, even though you will find a few folk who claim that they're part Indian. But officially, they were all driven out of the state of Pennsylvania. Again, it started out so great. But William Penn passed laws that favored Quakerism. He governed pretty much like a dictator, even though he did have a house. Yes.
Well, I don't know how true it is. Me being from New York, you and having gone to Pennsylvania a lot, you'll still see Indian people, but they live on reservations like
In Pennsylvania?
Yeah, like
I did not realize that.
Yeah,
I thought that all the reservations are out west.
No, it's something, but they don't look like what you would think. It's a real slummy-like area. So, like, when I came here to Georgia and I would see streets like Cherokee and all these, I was expecting to see tons of Indians. And
The South drove all the Indians west, except for a few. Now, there were the Cherokee who hid in the mountains of North Carolina, but we'll talk about that later. The Southern people drove them out. And then there were the Seminole Indians that lived down the Everglades where the whites did not want to go, because the rattlesnakes were 8 feet long and alligators, whatever, and the mosquitoes were bad. The Seminole were bragging. So there are a few Seminoles living in Florida and a few Cherokee that still come around to here, but you don't see very many Indians in the South, but a few managed to hide.
But you'll see them in Pennsylvania, but not like, they're more prevalent up north than they are here. Like, you can go for years and never see an Indian here in Georgia.
That is true.
Years. And you know it when you see them because they have a unique look about them.
Yeah. Okay, I'll stand corrected. But
No,
a lot of them have. I mean, a lot of them though were driven out of Pennsylvania owing to the fact that they stole some white children, saying we have a right to because you killed some of our children. Again, folks, the point I want to make about this is you had two different kinds of people, completely different, and inevitably they were going to clash. And does this go on in our world today? Believe me. Yes, it does. Different kinds of people with different worldviews and different ideas of what liberty and life is and what government should be and what laws should be. And inevitably there's going to be clashes. All right. Now, Well, yeah, Pennsylvania became the only colony that only had one House legislature. That is not true today. But see, the other colonies, they followed the rule of England, where they had two houses. And England was a House of Commons and a House of Lords. Pennsylvania only had one. They said we don't need two separate houses. Now again, today they do have a House and a Senate, like the other states, most of the other states do. All right, time went on. The Navigation Acts were passed. Now, this is very important. The Navigation Acts said that all colonial trade had to be done on English ships manned by English crews. In other words, you colonies can only trade with England. If a French ship comes to port, you're not allowed to put any of your wares on that French ship. You're ours and you trade only with us. Now, this was not always obeyed because some colonials would load up goods on a colonial ship, and then once the colonial ship was out of sight, they would head to Spain or France or anywhere they wanted to. But nevertheless, those laws were in the books. The Navigation Acts, yeah, this is a V, ultimately were to lead to war between the United States and England. And again, folk, I don't know how much American history you know, but I do hope that all of you know that the United States fought a big war with England early in their history. Hopefully all of you have heard that at some point or another. Yes. But this was one of the things that led to them. Colonials resented it. Now, there was a lot of trade between the colonies and the West Indies also. And again, it had to be done on English ships. England eventually got Jamaica, and Admiral William Penn was one of the men who helped take Jamaica from the Spanish. And if you go to Jamaica today, you'll find they speak English, but it's a form of English that some of us have a hard time understanding. Nevertheless, they speak English here because the English took over early. But anyway, now the colonies this time did not have a lot going on with each other. Like Massachusetts people did not visit Virginia very often, or vice versa. The colonies had more to do with England than they did each other. So a Massachusetts man might, or Massachusetts goods might find their way to England more than they would to New York or to Virginia or the Carolinas. Again, because the colonies felt closer bound to England than they did to each other. Well, then came a war with the Indians. An Indian chieftain named Metacomet, we call him King Philip. King Philip's War. King Philip. Now, King Philip got the brilliant idea in 1680 of collecting all the Indian tribes together and sending the white man out, massacring the white man and forcing him to leave. There was one thing wrong with this plan. It was a good plan, except it was way too late. Now, by 1680, the Indians had the guns and knew how to use them. They had the horses and they became excellent horsemen. They never did become soldiers, but they wiped out several colonial settlements on the frontier. They did not realize that they did not have any chance at all of, by this time the colonials numbered too many, the white colonials, especially since New England women were having, I could say, 8, sometimes as many as 14 or 15 children, but averaging 8 or 9 children per woman. And also new arrivals were coming in from across the sea from Europe all the time. There were just too many whites living in New England or at the time, and the Indians simply had no chance at all winning, but King Philip didn't know that. The whites got together, banded together, formed a militia. The British sent an army over. They whipped King Philip, and this was the last major Indian uprising in New England. Came too late. Now, I want to say about the Indian fighting, morally it was justifiable. Now, hear this from a white man. The white man was not keeping his treaties. That was reason enough to fight, and also the land belonged to the Indians in the first place. All this was morally made the Indians more on moral high ground. but the other side of it, the fighting was suicide. And by this time, the Indians had no chance at all of winning. There were too many of them. American Indian women would only have about 2 or 3 babies per woman. And keep in mind, I mentioned this, I believe, last class. One of your books says, I didn't see it in this book, but one book I've taught from said that the average age of the Indian at death was only 18 years. Of course, a lot of that was because so many Indians died when they were still babies, and that brought the average down. But still, the Indians, actually, if the white man had not come over, the Indians might have become extinct. The white man might have saved them from extinction. This is not what you might have heard, but anyway, when King Philip's war was over, the King of England, by this time James II, he decided he would try to take over the Massachusetts colony himself, and he imposed a law on it that said property owners vote, not so property ownership became the basis for voting, not church membership. And this was upsetting to a lot of colonies a lot of colonies did not own property. Also, James II was a Catholic, and he was determined to make both the colonies and England Catholic again. So he sent over a bunch of governors who were Catholic. And well, to make a long story short, I mean, if any of you know anything at all about English history, James II failed. The people of England went to Prince William in Holland. He was also a cousin of James II, but he was a grandson of James I, even as James II was a grandson of James I. But anyway, actually he was the son of James I. But anyway, the Prince of Orange of Holland came into England with his army, and there was no fighting. James II fled. He took off running. He went to Italy, and to this day his descendants claim that we are the rightful heirs to the throne of England. Yes, they are, but your ancestor destroyed your heritage, and the throne goes to a different line of descent today. But yes, they are perhaps the rightful heirs. But anyway, James II was overthrown. And when he was overthrown, the word got around. The colonies rose up and they kicked out James's appointees. However, folks, this is what your book said. This is what happens to a lot of time when you rebel. King William, who took over, exerted more authority over the colonies than ever before. Something I want to say about rebellion, because we're going to be talking about rebellion in the chapters ahead, but most of the time, here's where it leads. You'll wind up worse off than you were before. The Cubans did not like Batista. They got rid of Batista and they got Castro. The people of Russia did not like the czars. They got rid of the last czar, shot him and his family dead, and they got Lenin and Stalin, Khrushchev and Brezhnev. Do you catch what I'm saying? And over again. You don't like, the people of France don't like the king that chopped off the king's head, and they wound up going through a reign of terror. They got Robespierre, and he killed 5,000 of them by cutting their heads off, one after another. This you can find out if you study world history. Now, I know if this has happened to a lot of folk, a lot of young men will decide, I don't like living at home. I don't like my mother telling me to clean the sink. I don't like my daddy setting rules down. I'm going to go where there won't be any rules. I'm going to go join the Marines.
Nice though. I think it'll
This
work.
actually happened. Well, my brother-in-law's brother-in-law, or him and his brother, 2 young men joined the Marines one time to get away from their father's rules. But I know another man who also joined the army to get away from rules, and after 4 years, he didn't like being in college because he didn't like the supervisor. Well, after going through a bunch of drill sergeants, 4 years in the army, he came back, same storm supervisor, but he liked the man this time. I mean, those Marine corporals and drill sergeants can make your daddy seem like a quiet, easygoing, soft-spoken, mild-mannered man. And I know what I'm talking about. Oh, yes. Anyway, the point is, they got rid of King James II and they got King William, but at least King William was Protestant.